Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Discerning Gamer. So I'm finally here with my long-awaited Dawn of War 3 multiplayer review. And I'm going to call it, I know obviously the beta that went on at the weekend was in name a beta, and we haven't got the full access to all of the elites and doctrines that we will in the final game. However, I think that what we saw in the beta was the fundamental mechanics and core elements of the multiplayer enough to tell us what we need to know about the launch version. I'm sure what we were playing is incredibly if similar, if not identical, to the launch version that we're going to get at the end of this week. So I feel fairly confident with the 20 or so hours that I've played in saying that this is my review of it and that I've got the right information to make a judgment. So the title, does it suck? Why would I frame this review in the negative? Well, because of the controversy around the game. Like Dawn of War 2 behind it, Dawn of War before it, Dawn of War 3 has made some pretty fundamental changes to the way that the franchise plays. Not only in the history of the Dawn of War franchise, but also in terms of most recent Relic games like Company of Heroes 2. And oftentimes fans, and particularly people who are into 40k and RTS fans, are averse to change. They think, we often see stuff and think, well, Jesus, why couldn't you just made the game that I loved, that I poured hundreds of hours into, give it some new units, new factions, a fresh lick of paint, and that would be fine, Bob's your uncle. Well, yes and no. I like to encourage diversity and innovation and thoughtful game making, and but I suppose that changing this stuff up does make people think, oh god, it's not going to be what I wanted because I wanted more of the same and it's going to suck. So that's why I'm framing it in this kind of context. So for this review, I'm going to be focusing on the fundamental mechanics and overarching balance decisions of the game at launch, because for me they're going to decide whether the game will be fun to play at launch but also will be worth investing into in the long term, whether it's going to be able to foster a strong enough competitive scene and community to make the game worth it, not just for the first month, but going on for 6, 12 months, 2 years, as it was with Dawn of War 1 and Dawn of War 2 for me personally. And broadly speaking, the minutiae of balance can be changed, but it's very, very rare that we see a game actually have its fundamental mechanics changed after release, or have the broad kind of balance philosophy of the entire game changed after release. And so that's what I'm focusing on in this review, because I think it's going to be the thing that defines the trajectory of the game, not only at release but also going forward. And of course we want this to be a game that we can invest in the long term and get a lot of value out of, particularly because as RTS players there isn't a huge abundance of RTS games out there right now, and we want something that's going to satisfy us for a long time, because there's just not the other titles. If this one's a dud, then there are not many other big budget RTS titles out there that we can really look forward to or sink our teeth into. So the first thing I want to address are the fundamental changes to the way the game plays. And I know a lot of you will be familiar with this, some of you might not, but I think it's important to define what you're actually reviewing and what you're talking about, and make sure we're all kind of reading from the same page when we're discussing what we do and don't like about the game. So initially I'm going to talk about the nature of the changes that we see, and my experience with them, and then I will then go on later to actually deliver judgment on them as to whether it's a good or a bad thing. So the first topic, broad heading, I want to talk about is the economics of the game, or the macro management. So that's the resource system and the buildings, the way you're producing your army. So Obviously, in Dawn of War 3, we see the return of base building and quite a significant tweak to the resource system. We also see the introduction, of battle phases. And for the uninitiated, battle phases change the way or the rate at which income is generated and the amount of resources refunded to the player when units are lost. And the kind of aim of that is to deliver distinct phases to the game and change the playstyle, basically make it so that you avoid being potentially too punishing for early losses, but also then providing a kind of ramp up with more resources to provide a climactic end game and a recognisable escalation in the battle as we go along. So, to first of all address base building, it's back, but it has a greater but also more limited scope than Dawn of War 1. There are less buildings, but from a gameplay perspective, I think you can actually do more with them. Each race has got 2 infantry production buildings and 1 vehicle production building, which is more similar to Company of Heroes 2, for example. As the most basic infantry buildings are only 200 requisition, I think we're encouraged to build them closer to the front line and in more risky places, and even have multiple copies of that building in different places, not only to provide additional manufacturing output, but also to give us more places to fall units back to and reinforce, and also produce units to then attack and harass different parts of the map. And they need to be spread about the map because, of course, the retreat mechanic is gone from this game, so we don't have a convenient way to get our units to sprint all the way back to base and reinforce. Now they would have to run at their normal speed all the way there, reinforce and run all the way back. And because of battle phases and the way that they massively increase the rate at which resource points generate the resources, we're, I think, going to be encouraged to build multiple production structures in order to rebuild our armies quicker and pump out a constant stream of units more quickly as the battle goes on. And I think that that's something that as the game releases and people get more familiar with it, we will see a lot more. So the changes to the resource system are that you don't just get resources for capturing a point anymore. You need to capture it, you then need to build a resource extractor on the point itself to actually gain any benefit from controlling that point. And you can also make those extractors immune from damage by building listening posts. And this means that you have to give more thought to your economic strategy, and you actually have to invest in resource generation in the early game at the expense of unit production, which is quite significant when in the early game the resource generation is much slower compared to the later game because of the battle phases. And I think that this, broadly speaking, opens up new and interesting strategic decisions and adds a layer of economic complexity that has been absent in previous iterations of the franchise. It also means that economic harassment is now something that is more difficult to achieve, but also more impactful when it happens, and also more difficult to recover from if you're the player that's been subjected to this harassment. And also I'd like to expand on sort of the way the battle phases work. So they escalate from phase 1 to phase 4, and in the early stage they give you a refund on, or I think it's just in the first 2 stages, they give you a refund on units that die, and that tails off between phase 1 and 2, and then I think it's completely gone in phase 3. And that's interesting because whilst the resource generation is quite low in the game, the earlier phases, it helps to avoid a situation in Dawn of War 2 where if you lost 1 or 2 of your squads in the beginning of the game, then you were more than likely finished for that game and just had to concede, whereas this gives you a bit more comeback power. And it sort of makes the initial phases feel like an opening skirmish with a few units to lay claim to resource points. And then as the phases escalate, you get a lot more benefit from these resource points as the rate at which they generate resources is increased. And finally we move into kind of a full battle phase where we're pumping out loads of units and actually have enough kind of resource generation to fully exploit the whole tech tree and get access to the most powerful units that are actually going to be able to kill the base turrets and end the game. So those are what I see as the major changes to the kind of economical macro elements of Dawn of War 3 compared to the rest of the franchise. Now moving on to map design. So we've seen 3 maps in the open beta and at least 3 others leaked in footage from the closed beta or other footage that's been put out by reviewers or Relic. So I can say with confidence that we've seen at least 6 of the 8 maps that we're going to get on release, and they all follow a reasonably similar formula. This formula, broadly speaking, is one that divides the routes to resource points and multiplayer objectives into lanes, in inverted commas, with various choke points in between those lanes, allowing you to cross between them. The lanes themselves are not straight corridors, and they do offer a lot of freedom to the way you approach them, but you can see that throughout various portions of them they're dominated by choke points that could be high ground or concealment or a heavy cover shield. We very rarely in the maps see wide open areas that would allow you to maneuver a big army in the kind of 150 population range that you tend to see at the end of the game. And I think this could be as an attempt to encourage players to perhaps split their army and attack through different routes and have a wider battlefront. But actually I think as the game stands at the moment, you can't really split your army because unit lethality is so high. You can lose units so quickly that if you split your army and the opponent doesn't, and then he attacks you, you're going to lose all of it without doing very much damage to him and be left with 2 sort of useless halves of an army. Because units die so quickly now, it's very difficult to hold the enemy's attention with a smaller force whilst you manoeuvre another one into position. And this is kind of more in line with what we saw in Dawn of War 3, but also quite a big departure from that also, and obviously a very big departure from what we saw in Dawn of War 1. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is unit design. So on the topic of unit design, broadly speaking, the game tends towards Dawn of War 1. You can have multiple hero units on the fields, your units don't gain veterancy. However, compared to Dawn of War 1, the units in Dawn of War 3 are much more fragile and clearly meant to have some degree of disposability to them and to also be produced en masse. Though the retreat mechanic's been removed, there are still rewards associated with unit preservation, being that it's typically about 30% cheaper to fully reinforce a squad compared to actually building a new one. The non-elite line units, in inverted commas, are much more fragile than in previous iterations of the franchise, often being killed by, for example, a mass group of snipers or heavy weapons teams, or more commonly than that, by the abilities of elites. So most of the elites that we saw in the beta have an aimed area of effect attack that allows you to pretty much instantly kill the majority of, if not the whole of, the sort of standard cheaper squads that we see, your tactical marines, your dire avengers, your slugger boys. These attacks can be dodged, but and also mitigated, I suppose, by spreading your army out better. But if there are 2 skilled players, equally skilled players going at one another, and one has an elite and the other doesn't, the one that doesn't is going to be at almost an irrecoverably massive disadvantage in that fight. And that's made particularly pronounced by the lack of economic cost attached to your elites. So if one player decides to spend his elite points in the early game on a early game hero, then and the other player doesn't, that player that has the early game elite is going to have just as much, just the same size as army as the other player, but they are also going to have this sort of elite killing machine on their side as well. In my experience, this leads to a lack of strategic decision making around elites. One might imagine that you could pick a lineup of high cost elites and hold the enemy off in your early game to then experience a late game power swings when all of your higher cost elites become available and hit the field. But in reality, this just doesn't seem viable. If you don't deploy a 3 or 4 point elite in the early game against a similarly skilled player who does, you're just going to lose. You'll lose so much map control and units that you're probably not going to be able to recover. Another thing to note about the fragility of units is that it places much more of an emphasis on your ability to plan for losses and replace them, also known as macro in strategy game parlance. Against a similarly skilled player later in the game, you're bound to lose large portions of your units when you're attacking a shield generator or a turret objective, or just in fights where there are AoE tank weapons or higher tier elites available. So unlike nearly all the recent Relic games, there's quite an emphasis put on building multiple buildings and being able to manage the continuous creation of units and their reinforcement to the main battle line, which is something we see in more traditional real-time strategy games like Command and Conquer or StarCraft. And the final piece I wanted to talk about in terms of, big new mechanical changes that we've got with this game is the victory condition of Power Core, which is totally different to the victory points that we saw in Dawn of War 2, and obviously different to the Annihilation mode that we saw in Dawn of War 1. So it's a much debated part of the game, and I will say that upon experiencing it, it doesn't actually change the formula of the game that deeply. Essentially, in order to be able to take out your opponent's shield generator and turrets, you have to have a larger army than him, and you have to be able to replace losses from attacking these objectives faster than he can. Otherwise, he's just going to swing straight back and destroy your objective, and it's tit for tat. And what this essentially means is that, as with the vast bulk of all RTS games, if there's two equally skilled players, the player with the most resources usually wins. And so that means that, as resources come from map control in this game, if you control the map, then you're going to win the game, which makes it very similar to the way Dawn of War 1 played, and also very similar to the victory condition in Dawn of War 2. So in my experience, the Power Core game mode really just plays out as a more strung out version of the Annihilation that we see in other strategy games or Dawn of War 1. So at this point, I've highlighted all the main differences, and you can probably get some sort of indication as to my feelings from how I've just talked about them, but I wanted to give kind of a TLDR overall verdict for you to digest, and then I'm going to go back over each of the main big points that have changed and give you a more in-depth verdict on those and how they stack up over the whole game. So the quickie verdict is, I think that the game is good. I think it's a solid base for the franchise to build from, and for this particular game to build from, in terms of new content and further balance patches, things like that. But I do think that there are some broad balance changes that need to be made post-launch, and that isn't going completely against what was initially presented to us or the philosophy of the game, but I think that some tweaks need to happen. At present, elites are too powerful and constitute a bit of a no-brainer. they don't live up to their potential as an interesting strategic choice where you think, oh, well, maybe I'll have a late game elite or just an early game elite. You're almost pigeonholed into definitely taking an early game elite and definitely taking a one of the super walkers, because if the game drags out that long and you don't have one, then it's going to be very difficult to deal with. The line units die too quickly, I think, for the average player to have an engaging micro experience with them. I think the maps, particularly in team modes, are at the moment a bit too linear to really accommodate high level interesting play within the late game. However, despite these criticisms, at present the game is fun. It does present a variety of interesting strategic decisions, and the core mechanics of the game show promise enough to be developed in the long term into a competitive gem. I think that the main criticisms that I have with this game can be easily changed with some broad balance changes, such as increasing the line unit health by 20% or an across the board nerf to damage, but also specifically a nerf to the amount of damage that elites do with their abilities, and perhaps just bringing their health down a slight bit. I don't think their auto attack is a big problem, it's just those abilities that are able to be targeted and wipe out multiple squads without really giving anyone a chance to react, and making the elites a no-brainer. That's what needs to be changed. Also, the fact that the game is launching with a map designer will let the community address the map issue, and in all their previous games, Relic has shown a real will to include well-made community maps into patches, and I think that's probably what we're going to see with Dawn of War 3 as well. So, with the broad verdict on the table, I'll go back over the main areas that I've highlighted and give a more in-depth verdict on what I think of those and how they play out. So my verdict on the macro or economic side of Dawn of War 3, broadly speaking, I think that what they've done with base building is great and opens a lot of gameplay depth and strategic possibility. Making the starting buildings relatively cheap and allowing players to build them anywhere on the map opens up a lot of options for clever placements of buildings, for reinforcement to support an attack, but likewise gives your opponent and yourself new opportunities for harassment and rewards for maintaining vision across the map and scouting properly. I think it also alleviates the lack of a retreat button, as you get a significant advantage from having aggressively placed buildings, allowing your units to quickly move back to a reinforcement or healing point. The changes to the resource system are also something that I see as very positive. It adds another level of decision making about when you're going to choose to invest in resources, improving your economy, and allows your opponent to pick up on this through proper scouting, seeing how many resource extractors you've built. It also makes harassment simultaneously more important and more impactful and difficult to recover from, but also easier to respond to, because you can see that your points are being attacked and have some time to respond to that, rather than just having a point decaptured. It gets rid of that old dynamic from Dawn of War 2 of having the fight mainly over the central victory point and occasionally flinging out the odd squad to go and take out, just decap the opponent's things without there really being any real intention or tension or strategic choice on that. It's just something that sort of happened sometimes. And the battle phase system, I don't feel like I can make a complete judgment on it yet, just because we haven't had enough time to play out with it, to see how it plays out with higher tier players by watching replays, etc. However, I do think that they work well, and they give the game a distinctive flow, which will help less hardcore RTS players get a better experience out of the game without necessarily hampering the depth or enjoyment of the game at a competitive level. My only criticism is that sometimes Phase 1's feels like it is dragging out a little bit long and artificially holding me back from taking up or pushing my opponent's objectives by limiting my access to anti-structure weapons. So to go on to talk about the map design to me is an interesting one. My overall feeling is that it could be better, but it serves its purpose for now. I think that one of the reasons we only have 8 maps at release is that Relic actually weren't totally confident with how to design maps for this game. It's a big departure from all of their endeavours for a long while now, and I also think this is why they're launching the game with a community map maker from the get-go, with the hopes that the community will be able to iterate more quickly than they can, and then perhaps they can polish up community maps and release them as official ones via a patch. In the early stages of the game, the maps provide plenty of room to manoeuvre troops, but as the game drags on, the bottlenecks in the map actually make it difficult to properly manoeuvre or engage with the larger armies that we see later in the game, and I do think that they hamper some of the gameplay perspectives there, because as I said, I don't feel like splitting up your forces is a totally legitimate option at the moment. What I'd like to see is wider areas perhaps outside of each of the bases, and perhaps areas that can even be opened up or made more wide with destructible parts of the map or new routes that can be accessed later on in the game somehow. You could even tie it to escalation phases. There's no reason that couldn't change the map, as it has quite a broad change to the overall way that the game plays economically. So although the maps are suboptimal at this point, I think that they are functional for the moment, and I think that they will get us through the first few months of the game, and that they will get better post-launch. So for my verdict on unit design, I think that either this or victory conditions will be the most contentious parts of this video, and also on people's opinions of Dawn of War 3 broadly. My general thoughts are pretty much along the same vein as map design. I think at present it's functional. The units are varied, they have a good interplay and mix of counters, and encourage different styles of play and diversity. I think they're all well designed, with interesting quirks and abilities and upgrades that keep most of them relevant throughout the game and give lots of opportunities to demonstrate skill when microing them and good decision making broadly. However, my main concern at the moment is that units are too fragile. They die really quickly to elites and to their heavier weapons later in the game, and I don't think that you should be able to save all of your units, or that having to replace unit losses is a bad thing. In fact, I think that adding an extra layer of skill to planning your buildings and constantly pumping out units is a great thing in the later game. However, with the units being so fragile and the battles being so visually chaotic later in the game, the fragility of units means that they're often reduced to a chunky paste on the ground before you can ever meaningfully interact with them on a micro level. So I think that post-release we will either see a broad nerf to damage or a broad buff to unit health pools, both basically having the same effect. I think that it's one of the places that unit lethality is the largest problem, is where regular units relate to elites. At present, as I said earlier, elites in the early game are pretty much a must-have. There's no strategic decision making around them because they're just so good at killing your early game line units really quickly with their abilities. I'd also say that perhaps the elites have just a bit too much health, but that their auto attack is fine. It's the elites' abilities where they can reduce like 1,000 requisitions worth of units to giblets in under 5 seconds that causes issues, and I think that broadly these need to be nerfed post-release, and I hope that they will be. This will mean that there'll be more variety in elite strategy, hopefully meaning that people can hold off to the mid or late game to get an elite out, rather than the game absolutely necessitating them in getting an early game elite and removing a deeper layer of strategic choice. Again, I want to reiterate, I don't think it's game breaking. The game is fun and competitive at the moment, but for its long-term health, I think that this is something that does need to be addressed post-release. So finally, coming back full circle to the victory condition, I know this has been a contentious issue in the community of because of how similar it is on the surface to a MOBA. But I really only see it as an expanded take on Annihilation and found it to work perfectly well. The game is broadly decided on map control, as that dictates who holds the economic advantage, making it broadly similar to most Relic titles. The victory condition to me is functional and fun, and it actually has a bit more depth to it than victory points, as you're able to garrison the shield generators, use stun abilities on the turrets, and actually hide the power core itself to give you a bit more time to maneuver and take a good engagement around it. And that's much more involving for the defender and the attacker alike. I would like to see victory points or another mode added into the game later on, but I think at the moment Power Core does its job fine, is a fine addition to the franchise, and will do well into the future as long as we can get some slightly better maps to go along with it. So Dawn of War 3 is both a big departure from what we've seen in other games, but it's also deceptively close in a lot of ways too. I think it's mechanically sound, and it has a lot of potential in the future to be a long-lived and deeply competitive game. Is it perfect on launch? Clearly not, for the reasons I've highlighted above. But is it fun and deep enough to foster a competitive scene? Absolutely. It's just how well Relic responds to the community demands and updates the game post-launch that will dictate the longevity of the multiplayer scene. I broadly have faith in them to do this with Sega's support on the publishing side. In recent years, Sega has seen the stagnation and relative lack of competition in the PC market for strategy games, and I think they've capitalised on it handsomely. Dawn of War 3 has the potential to be a great platform for further expansions, adding in new races and units with substantial pieces of DLC, as we've seen previously in the series. And I hope that the game does well enough at launch that it will be supported aggressively and in the post-launch phase to actually live up to its potential. I will give this caveat. Is that the game is good, but if you prefer a smaller scale experience that focuses much more around individual unit micro and unit preservation, Dawn of War 3 is probably a break too far from the tradition for you. But if you enjoy strategy games more broadly, I think mechanically at least there's a lot here to like. So guys, I'm sure a lot of you played in the beta over the weekend. What did you think of Dawn of War 3? Do you agree with what I've had to say here? Did it live up to your expectations? Will you be picking it up at launch? I'd really like to know what you guys think about it, because obviously I would like to probably make another video responding to actually how the game performed at launch and how I think it's going to perform in the long run, as it is something I would like to play long past initial release, and I would hope to see supported over that time period too. So please do let me know in the comments below. I hope this review is useful in helping you make an informed purchasing decision and getting a bit more insight into Dawn of War 3. If you enjoyed the video, please do drop a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. I've been the Discerning Gamer. Until next time.